The cowboy was a man most folks in town barely knew, and that was exactly how he liked it. His name, whispered on occasion in saloons and feed stores, was Eli Turner, but people preferred to call him the Quiet One, or simply that rancher, out by the edge of nowhere. He lived several miles outside of town, where the land stretched wide and open, broken only by the weathered fences he had built with his own hands. Eli wasn't old, perhaps in his early 30s, but life had already etched deep lines of solitude across his face. He wore a wide-brimmed hat low, shadowing eyes that seemed always watchful, yet distant, as if searching horizons for something long lost. His ranch wasn't the largest or the richest, but it was kept with care. Cattle moved in steady rhythm. Across the pasture, horses gleamed under the sun, and the small cabin stood sturdy against the prairie winds. What set Eli apart wasn't wealth or skill with a gun, though he had both in quiet measure. It was the way he carried himself. He spoke little, only when necessary, and when he did, his words were measured, calm, and steady, like water in a desert creek. Some townsfolk mistook his silence for arrogance. Others figured he had nothing worth saying. But the truth was simpler. Eli had seen enough of the world to know that talk was cheap, while actions carried the weight of truth. Years earlier, rumor had it, he'd fought in skirmishes along the frontier, though he never confirmed it. He came back with a scar across his shoulder and a silence that hung heavier than any story he could tell. Since then, he had chosen the life of a rancher, tending his land and avoiding the noise of townsfolk politics, whiskey brawls, and gossip. He was a man who preferred the company of his horses to crowded rooms. Yet, despite his reserved ways, Eli was respected, even admired. Ranch hands tipped their hats when he rode by. Children stared wide-eyed at him from porches, whispering that he looked like the heroes in dime novels. Shopkeepers trusted him to pay his dues, even if he didn't carry much coin in hand. People knew he wasn't a man who lied, cheated, or stirred trouble. Still, he was a mystery, and mysteries made folks restless. Eli's daily routine reflected his nature. He would rise before the sun, saddle up his horse Dusty, and ride the fence line, mending where needed. He worked quietly with cattle, using patience rather than a whip, moving them as though he spoke their language. When chores were done, he might sit on his porch with a book, though he never told anyone what he read, or simply stare at the vast expanse of sky. Nights were lonelier, the silence broken only by the crackle of his fire or the mournful howl of coyotes in the distance. Etched, town. He came only when necessity demanded it. Flour, salt, ammunition, or replacement tools. When he did ride in, people would stop and notice. Not because he sought attention. He never did. But because his presence was striking. He moved through the dusty streets with quiet confidence, hat tilted low, spurs clinking softly. He rarely lingered. He would tie his horse outside the general, store, make his purchases, and be gone before most folks had worked up the nerve to greet him. Though Eli avoided company, there were times when he helped without being asked. Once a child had gone missing near the river, and while the town organized search parties that argued more than they searched, Eli had saddled up and found the boy within hours, cold but safe. Another time, he lent his tools and time to mend a widow's roof after a storm. He never asked for thanks, and when gratitude was offered, he only tipped his hat and rode off. To outsiders, he was simply a quiet cowboy. But for those who paid attention, his silence spoke of discipline, patience, and a kind of unspoken strength. He was the type of man who would rather act when needed than boast about what he could do. And though he seemed content with his solitary existence, there was a heaviness in his eyes, a shadow hinting that his life was not as peaceful as he made it seem. Some evenings he would ride out to the ridge overlooking town, where lanterns flickered in windows and laughter carried faintly on the wind. He would sit there for a while, as though deciding whether to ride down and join them, but he never did. Instead, he turned back toward the stillness of his ranch, where the stars stretched endless and cold above him. That was Eli Turner, the quiet stranger who kept to himself. No one could have guessed that fate was about to pull him into a story that would shatter the silence he had built around his life. For in just a short while, a trip to town for something as ordinary as a sack of flour would set him on a path that changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone who would witness what he was about to do. The morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of day when the sky stretched so wide it seemed to swallow the earth. Eli Turner rose before the first light, as always. He moved through the motions of ranch life without thought, feeding the horses, checking the cattle, tightening the posts along the fence line. Work was a rhythm, and rhythm kept a man steady. But that morning, a small list weighed in his pocket: flour, coffee, lamp oil, and a length of rope. Supplies had run thin, and though he disliked town, necessity pushed him toward it. By mid-morning, Eli saddled Dusty, his bay gelding, and began the ride. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard-packed trail. The prairie wind carried with it the smell of sagebrush and dust, and for long stretches, the only sound was the creak of leather and the faint jingle of his spurs. Eli preferred it this way: miles of open land, silence thick as a blanket, no need for words or worry. But as he neared town, something shifted. Even before the rooftops and church steeple came into view, he could sense a different kind of energy on the air. A commotion. Dust hung in the sky above Main Street, stirred by restless horses and hurried boots. Town was never truly quiet, but this was something else. He nudged Dusty forward. When Eli entered the edge of town, eyes turned to him the way they always did: curious, measuring, cautious. The quiet rancher was a familiar sight, but today no one stopped him with a nod or casual word. Instead, folks were moving in one direction, gathering toward the square, their faces lit with the sort of feverish curiosity that usually followed trouble. Eli slowed Dusty, watching from under the brim of his hat. He could have gone about his business, tied his horse outside the general store, and slipped in to collect his supplies. That was the way he usually did things. But today, he felt the pull of that crowd. Whatever was happening had stirred the whole town, and ignoring it would mean turning his back on something more than noise. The sound reached him before the sight: jeers, rough laughter, and the occasional sharp crack of a whip against wood. It was not the sound of celebration, nor of simple barter at the market. It was harsher, crueler. Eli's jaw tightened. Riding closer, he saw the crowd gathered around a crude wooden platform set up at the center of town. A man Eli knew, Silas Crane, the merchant who dealt in everything from horses to whiskey, stood there like a self-proclaimed king, waving his arms as he barked to the crowd. At his feet, chained and bound, was a girl. Eli reined Dusty to a stop. She was young, perhaps no more than 17 or 18, with long dark hair hanging loose and tangled, her clothes torn from struggle. Iron shackles bit into her wrists, and though her face bore dust and bruises, her eyes burned with something unbroken: pride, defiance, and a silence every bit as strong as Eli's own. Crane's voice boomed over the noise of the gathering. "Caught her myself! A wild one, straight from the hills, strong as any laborer, and she'll fetch a fine price. Who here will make the first offer?" The crowd roared with excitement, though not all faces reflected agreement. Some looked on uneasily, shifting their weight, unwilling to speak against Crane's booming authority. Others shouted numbers, offering coin as if she were no more than a mule. Eli felt his chest tighten. Slavery wasn't law in these parts, not anymore. But men like Crane had a way of twisting rules, of making cruelty look like commerce. The sheriff stood nearby, silent, either bribed or too cowardly to intervene. And the girl, this stranger, in chains, stood with her chin lifted, refusing to bow her spirit even as the crowd pressed in around her. Dusty shifted beneath Eli, sensing his rider's unease. Eli's hand brushed the reins, but he didn't move forward, not yet. He simply watched. He had learned long ago that rushing in without thought could cost a man his life. And yet, as he looked at the girl, he knew this was no ordinary trouble. Something about her struck deep. Perhaps her silence, or the fire in her gaze, or the way she seemed so utterly alone in that moment. The crowd's laughter rang out again, harsh and biting. A man spat at her feet. Another tugged at her chain, testing her strength. She yanked back, fierce as a wolf cornered but unbroken. Crane laughed and raised his hands for silence. "Who'll pay good coin to own this savage beauty?" he bellowed. Eli's hand closed into a fist. He hadn't come to town looking for trouble, but trouble, it seemed, had been waiting for him. And though he was known for his quiet ways, there were times when silence could no longer hold. For now, he remained astride his horse, still on the edge of the crowd, unseen by most. Watching, listening. But deep inside, the decision was already forming, quiet as the tightening of a trigger. This was not something he could ride past. The girl stood at the center of the wooden platform, her wrists bound in heavy shackles, iron so rough it cut into her skin. Dust and sweat streaked her face, and a dried line of blood traced from her temple down to her cheek. Yet despite the filth and bruises, there was a fierceness about her, the kind that no man's cruelty could strip away. Her back was straight, her chin lifted, and her dark eyes met the jeering crowd with a calm that unsettled more than a few onlookers. Eli Turner watched her from the saddle, his hand resting lightly on Dusty's reins. He'd seen men broken before, soldiers, drifters, even ranchers crushed by drought or debt. But this girl wasn't broken. She was chained, yes, and beaten, yes. But there was something in her gaze that dared anyone to call her less than human. Something that dared the world to forget her spirit. Silas Crane strutted around her like a man parading prize stock at an auction. He tugged at the chain fixed to her wrists and yanked her forward, showing off her strength as though she were no more than a mule. She stumbled, but didn't fall, jerking her arm back so violently that Crane nearly lost his balance. The crowd laughed at the spectacle, some clapping, some jeering, others whispering uneasily. "See that fire!" Crane shouted. "She'll fetch double the worth of any field hand, strong as an ox and twice as wild. Now, who'll start the bidding?" A greasy fellow near the front raised his hand. $10, he barked, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made Eli's stomach churn. 10? Crane scoffed. "She's worth 10 times that. 20, 30, who'll give me 30? More shouts followed. Men called numbers like they were bidding on cattle. Laughter rose when the girl spit defiantly at the boots of one bidder, a thin stream of dust and spit striking the ground. Crane slapped her hard across the face. The sound cracked through the air, silencing even the rowdiest of voices. The girl's head snapped to the side, her lips split, but she did not cry out. She only turned back, her eyes blazing hotter than before. Eli felt his jaw tighten. He gripped the saddle horn until the leather creaked under his hand. Every instinct in him told him to stay quiet, to keep his head low, to let the town's business pass him by. That was the way he had lived these last years. Out of the way, out of trouble. But watching the girl endure humiliation after humiliation, standing unbroken despite it all, stirred something deep in him. Something he thought he had buried long ago. The sheriff leaned against a post nearby, arms folded, eyes avoiding the scene. A man sworn to uphold the law, yet blind when faced with Crane's power. Eli noticed it, and so did the townsfolk. Some shifted uncomfortably, some whispered. No one dared to act. Crane's money reached into every corner of town. Eli's gaze returned to the girl. She was young, yet her face carried the weight of someone who had seen more cruelty than any soul should bear. He wondered what road had led her here. Was she taken from her people in the hills, dragged away under the cover of night? Did she leave behind family, a mother, a father, brothers and sisters waiting for her return? Their eyes met. Just for an instant, her burning gaze locked with his cool, steady one. And in that instant, Eli felt the silence between them carry a weight words could not hold. She did not plead, she did not beg. She only looked at him as if measuring him, testing whether this quiet stranger was another man who would look away or one who would act. Crane jerked her chain again, pulling her forward as if to break the unspoken connection. "Don't be fooled by those eyes," he sneered. "She's wild, dangerous, needs a firm hand to tame her." The crowd murmured, half in agreement, half uneasy at the sight of her defiance. A few women turned their faces, unable to watch. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed. And Eli sat tall on his horse, feeling the slow, steady rise of something inside him. Anger. Not the quick, reckless kind, but a quiet, steady flame. The kind that could not be ignored. Eli Turner had lived years avoiding fights, keeping his silence, letting the world go its own way. But as he sat there, watching the girl stand proud in her chains, he knew something had shifted. The quiet rancher was no longer certain he could remain just an observer. Silas Crane was not a man born to power, but he wore it like a badge he'd stolen and dared anyone to take back. Thick-set, with a belly softened by years of indulgence, Crane still carried himself as though the town itself belonged to him. His coat was fine wool, though sweat stained its collar. Gold glinted from the chain of his pocket watch, and his boots were polished to a shine that most working men could never afford. But beneath the polish and bluster was a man built on cruelty, sharp-eyed, greedy, and ruthless. Everyone in town knew it. Crane was the kind of man who never did the work himself. He bought cheap, sold dear, and made sure every deal tilted in his favor. He owned the saloon, a share of the general store, and half the land that hugged the riverbanks. Folks who couldn't pay their debts found their livestock claimed by him. Families who fell behind on rent suddenly discovered their land transferred to his name. The law never seemed to stop him, for the sheriff owed Crane money too, and men in debt rarely bite the hand that feeds them. Now Crane stood on the platform like a showman, his grin wide, his voice oily as he paraded the shackled girl for bids. His words dripped with false charm, meant to whip the crowd into frenzy, but underneath, there was no disguising the menace. "Look at her, folks!" he shouted, tugging the chain roughly until the girl stumbled forward again. "Strong as a stallion. She'll cut your wood, haul your water, and if you've got the coin, well, she might even warm your bed." Laughter rippled through the crowd, though not everyone laughed. Some shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the sheriff. But the sheriff only leaned against the post, chewing on a toothpick, his hat tilted low. Crane's shadow stretched. Far, and even lawmen knew better than to stand against it. The girl spat at Crane's boots, her lip bloodied, but her pride untouched. The crowd hushed. For a heartbeat, silence pressed heavy on the square. Then Crane's face twisted, his smile curdling into something dark. He backhanded her so hard that she staggered to her knees. "Savage filth," he growled. "You'll learn obedience or you'll learn pain." Eli's hand tightened on Dusty's reins. His pulse thudded steady but heavy. He had seen men like Crane before. Bullying tyrants who fed on fear, who mistook cruelty for strength. He hated them all the more because they thrived not on their own power, but on the silence of others. Crane turned back to the crowd, masking his fury with another booming laugh. "She's spirited, no doubt about it. But that just makes her worth more coin. Who here's man enough to tame her?" Bids rose again. $15, $20, $25. Men called out numbers not because they wanted her, but because the fever of Crane's auction demanded it. Some faces glowed with hunger, others with discomfort, but none spoke against him. The townsfolk had grown used to swallowing their shame in exchange for peace. Eli's eyes drifted to the sheriff again. The man's indifference burned worse than Crane's cruelty. The law had no voice here. Justice had no teeth. And in that void, Crane reigned. The girl struggled back to her feet, chains clinking as she straightened her shoulders. Her breath came heavy, but she stood tall once more. Crane shoved her forward, and this time Eli swore he saw her eyes flick toward him again. Just a flicker, quick, sharp, as though she had recognized something in him. It unsettled him, not because she asked for help. She hadn't. But because she didn't. She carried herself like someone who refused to bow, who refused to plead. And yet, her silent strength called to him more loudly than any cry could have. Crane spread his arms. $30! Who will make it 30? Don't be shy now. This is the deal of a lifetime. No one answered. The excitement dimmed. Whispers stirred in the edges of the crowd. Some looked uneasy. $30 was more than most could part with. Crane's grin faltered, then twisted into a snarl. "What's wrong with you lot?" he snapped. "She's worth twice that and—" "You know it. Are you all cowards? Afraid of a slip of a girl in chains?" His voice carried anger now, frustration that his spectacle was losing steam. He yanked the chain again, hard enough to make the girl stumble. She caught herself, glaring at him with fire that made Eli's chest ache with a strange mix of fury and admiration, and then Eli heard his own voice, calm and steady, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "She's not yours to sell, Crane." The words seemed to echo louder than they were spoken. Heads turned. The sheriff lifted his gaze at last. Crane froze, blinking as though unsure he had heard right. All eyes turned toward the quiet cowboy on his bay gelding at the edge of the square. Eli Turner, the man of silence, the man who never meddled, had just spoken, and what he said was nothing short of rebellion. The square went still. For a moment, even the wind seemed to die as Eli's words hung heavy in the air. "She's not yours to sell, Crane?" The crowd turned as one, faces snapping toward the quiet cowboy at the edge of town. Eli sat straight in the saddle, his hat low, his eyes locked on the platform. He hadn't raised his voice, yet it carried with a weight that struck harder than a shout. Crane blinked, his fat lips twitching into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "What was that, Turner?" His tone was mocking, but there was a flicker of unease beneath it. Did the quiet rancher finally find his tongue? A few nervous laughs bubbled from the crowd, quickly swallowed. No one dared speak against Crane. But Eli didn't back down. His calm stare was fixed on the merchant like the sight of a rifle. "You heard me," Eli said, his voice steady. "That girl's not yours. No one's property. This auction ends now." A ripple moved through the gathering. Shock, disbelief, even a spark of admiration. Some men shifted as if they wanted to agree, but fear pinned their voices. Women clutched their children closer. The sheriff straightened at last, spitting his toothpick into the dirt before clearing his throat. "Now, Turner," the sheriff drawled. "Best you don't stick your nose in business that ain't yours." Crane's within his rights. Eli's gaze flicked to him. "The law don't give a man the right to chain another." The sheriff's face tightened, but he said nothing more. Everyone knew he was bought, and Eli's words cut close to that. Truth. Crane's false grin snapped into a snarl. His voice boomed like thunder, heavy with wounded pride. "You got some nerve, rancher. Think you can come riding in here, tell me how to run my affairs? You don't own this town. I do." The crowd gasped as Crane motioned to two of his hired men standing nearby, thick-necked brutes with pistols on their hips. They stepped forward, hands hovering over their holsters, waiting for the word. Dusty shifted beneath Eli, but the cowboy remained steady. He didn't draw. He didn't flinch. His silence spoke louder than any boast, his presence cutting through the bluster like a blade. "I'm not looking for trouble," Eli said softly. "But I won't stand by and let you. Do this!" The girl's eyes found him again, sharp and unyielding. For the first time since she'd been dragged onto that platform, something flickered in her expression. A mix of surprise and something else. Hope, maybe. Or at least the faint recognition that one man was willing to stand where all others stayed silent. Crane barked a laugh, though it rang hollow. "You? Alone? Against me and half this town? Don't be a fool, Turner. You'll lose everything you've got." Eli's hand slid down slowly, resting near the butt of his revolver. He didn't move fast, didn't make a show of it. He only let Crane and his men see that he was ready. His voice, when it came, was low but sharp as iron. "Then I'll lose standing for something worth keeping." The words cut like a whip crack. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Men glanced at each other, ashamed. Some looked away, unwilling to meet the girl's proud gaze. Others clenched their fists, but none spoke. Crane's face flushed red, rage boiling. Over. "Enough of this," he barked. "Take him down." The two hired guns stepped forward, hands closing over their pistols. The crowd scattered back, a wave of panic rolling outward. Mothers pulled children from the square. Men ducked behind posts. The sheriff muttered a curse but made no move to intervene. And still, Eli sat unmoving, calm as stone. His hat shadowed. His eyes, but his stare never left Crane. His hand rested lightly by his revolver, steady as the beat of his heart. He was outnumbered, outpowered, but not outwilled. The girl stood taller now, blood on her lip but fire in her eyes. She didn't cry for rescue. She didn't beg. She simply stood, chains rattling softly, watching the quiet cowboy make a choice no one else dared make. The choice to break his silence. The choice to stand against a tyrant. The choice that would change everything. As Crane's men tensed, the crowd held its breath. Somewhere, a horse stamped nervously. Dust swirled in the hot air. Eli Turner, the quiet cowboy, had made his decision. There was no turning back. The silence before violence was always the same, thick, heavy, suffocating. Eli Turner had lived long enough to recognize it. The crowd had pulled back into the shadows of porches and doorways, leaving the square bare except for Crane, his hired men, the girl in chains, and Eli himself. Dust floated in the sunlit air like ash before a storm. Crane's voice cracked through. The tension. "Well? What are you waiting for? Take him!" The two gunmen shifted forward, boots thudding against the boards of the platform. Both were broad-shouldered men with the look of those who'd spent their lives selling violence to whoever had the coin. Their hands hovered over their pistols, twitching with eagerness. The girl stood between them, chains clinking as she edged. Back. Her eyes locked on Eli as if silently urging him to hold fast. Eli didn't move. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture unshaken, one hand resting near the butt of his revolver. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, like the slow toll of a church bell. "You draw, you'd best not miss." The words rippled across the square, quiet but carrying. They weren't shouted, weren't dressed in bravado. They were a simple fact, spoken by a man who meant every syllable. The first gunman, bald-headed, scar slicing across his cheek, snorted. "You ain't fast enough for both of us, rancher." Eli's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Don't need to be." That gave them pause. The crowd, hidden along the edges, leaned closer, watching with wide eyes. The sheriff lingered near the post, hand twitching near his belt, but never daring to intervene. He'd been bought too many times to remember what law truly meant. Crane sneered, though his voice carried an edge of frustration. "Don't just stand there. He's one man against the lot of us." But one man was sometimes enough. Everyone felt it. The weight of Eli's calm, the steadiness of his stare. It wasn't the stance of a reckless fool. It was the Stance of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and worse, was willing to prove it. The bald gunman drew first, metal flashing in the sunlight. Eli's hand blurred. A single shot rang out, sharp as lightning. The gunman's weapon never cleared his holster. He staggered back, clutching his arm, blood spilling between his fingers as he collapsed against the platform railing. The second man froze, halfway through his draw, eyes wide with disbelief. Eli had barely moved, calm, precise, his revolver steady in his grip. Dusty stamped once, as if echoing the moment. "Don't," Eli said, his voice as cold as steel. The second gunman hesitated. He wasn't paid enough to die. Slowly, he lifted his hand away from his pistol and stepped back, his face pale under the brim of his hat. The crowd murmured, the hush breaking into whispers that spread like wildfire. Turner's fast. Turner's standing against Crane. Turner's not afraid. Crane's face flushed beet red. He looked from his wounded man to the one who had backed down, fury boiling in his eyes. "Cowards," he spat. "Both of you! Worthless!" His gaze snapped to Eli, voice dripping venom. "You'll regret this, Turner. You just signed your death warrant." Eli didn't lower his weapon. His horse shifted, but his aim never wavered. "Then come collect it yourself." The words struck like a challenge, and for a heartbeat, it seemed Crane might accept it. His hand twitched toward his sidearm, but his bluster outweighed his courage. He stepped back instead, snarling, covering his retreat with words. "This ain't over. Not by a damn sight. You think one trick shot makes you a hero? You've just made yourself a target. You and anyone fool enough to stand with you." Eli's eyes slid to the girl. She stood motionless, breath ragged, but her chin lifted higher than before. For the first time, something softened in her expression. Not gratitude, she was too proud for that, but acknowledgement, recognition of a man who'd chosen action over silence. The crowd slowly crept closer, whispers buzzing. Men who had looked away minutes ago now watched with a strange mix of awe and shame. Women clutched their children, their gazes flicking. Between Crane and the cowboy who had defied him, the sheriff finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "That's enough shooting for one day," he said, voice shaky. "Turner, let the girl go. Crane'll sort this out proper." Eli's gun didn't move. His voice cut through the sheriff's weakness like a blade. "The only thing getting sorted is these chains coming off her." Gasps rose from the crowd. Crane's face twisted in rage, but his men were beaten, and the sheriff wasn't about to risk his own skin. For the first time in years, Crane had been defied, and not by a mob, but by one man. Eli dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the dirt. He kept his revolver ready as he stepped toward the platform. Crane sputtered threats, but the cowboy's silence drowned him out. The girl's eyes followed Eli with unblinking focus, her chains rattling as she shifted closer. The moment had come. Either Eli freed her now, or he walked away forever. And Eli Turner wasn't a man who walked away anymore. The square was silent, but for the creak of the platform boards and the clink of chains. Eli stood at the base of the stage, revolver steady in his hand. Dust swirled in the sunlight, carrying the smell of gunpowder from his single shot. Crane's wounded man groaned where he lay, clutching his arm. The other had slunk away, hat low, hands raised in surrender. The sheriff shifted uneasily, tugging at his collar but making no move to step in. All eyes were on Eli Turner, the quiet cowboy who had finally broken his silence. He climbed the steps of the platform slowly, each bootfall ringing louder than the last. The crowd held its breath. Crane stumbled backward, his fine coat catching, against the rail, his face flushed with fury and something darker. Fear. "You don't know what you're doing, Turner," Crane spat, his voice high and trembling despite his effort to sound commanding. "She's mine. I caught her. I paid men to—" Eli cut him off, his voice low but sharp. "She's no one's." He turned his gaze to the girl. Her dark eyes locked with his, unblinking. There was no plea in her look, no soft gratitude. Instead, she met him with the fierce defiance that had carried her this far. For the first time, Eli thought he saw something flicker behind that fire. Trust. The chains clattered as Eli stepped closer. His revolver stayed leveled at Crane with his right hand, while his left reached down to the girl's shackles. The iron was old but heavy, padlocked tight. He pulled a small hunting knife from his belt, its blade worn from years of practical use. He jammed it into the lock, twisting hard. Crane surged forward. "Don't you touch—" Eli's revolver snapped toward him in a blur, the barrel glinting inches from Crane's chest. The merchant froze, his bluster cut short. "You take another step," Eli said coldly, "and I'll put you in the dirt beside your man." The crowd gasped. A murmur rippled outward, half in fear, half in awe. No one had ever spoken to Crane like that. No one had ever dared. The knife bit deeper into the lock. Metal groaned, then gave way with a sharp crack. The girl flinched as the shackle fell from her wrist, then her eyes widened as the weight lifted. Eli worked quickly on the second, his revolver still steady in his other hand. Another crack, another. Rattle of chains falling to the wooden boards. For the first time since she'd been dragged into town, the girl was free. She stood tall, rubbing her raw wrists, eyes never leaving Eli. The crowd erupted in whispers, some horrified, some thrilled, some already fearing what this would mean for the town. Crane's face turned purple with rage. "You fool!" he roared. "You've ruined yourself! You'll pay for this, Turner. You'll lose your land, your cattle, everything. I'll see to it myself." Eli didn't answer. Words meant nothing to men like Crane. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of coins, hard-earned money from weeks of cattle work. He tossed it at Crane's feet, the silver clinking on the boards. "Consider that payment for what you stole," Eli said. The gesture silenced the crowd again. It wasn't the value. It was the principle. Eli had shown he wasn't acting out of theft, but out of justice. Crane could rage all he liked, but everyone had seen the truth. The girl stepped closer to Eli, her eyes narrowing at Crane before flicking back to the cowboy. She didn't speak, but her stance said enough. She was with him now. Eli holstered his revolver, offering her his hand. For a moment she hesitated, pride bristling, spirit unbowed. But then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. He helped her. Down from the platform, steadying her as the chains clattered forgotten behind them. The crowd parted as they walked, whispers rising like a tide. Mothers held their children close. Men exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded faintly at Eli, respect flickering in their eyes. Others turned away, afraid of what Crane's vengeance might bring. Behind them, Crane shouted threats, his voice breaking with fury. "You'll regret this, Turner! You'll regret the day you crossed me!" Eli didn't look back. Dusty stood waiting, reins dangling. He helped the girl into the saddle first, then swung up behind her, the horse shifting under their combined weight. As they rode down the street, the crowd melted aside. The sun caught on the broken chains left on the platform, glinting like a relic of a battle not yet finished. The quiet cowboy had spoken, and in that single, bold rescue, he had set into motion a storm that would shake the town and the frontier forever. Dusty's hooves thundered against the hard-packed road, carrying Eli and the girl out of town. The air behind them still echoed with Crane's curses, but the further they rode, the more those shouts were swallowed by distance and wind. The girl clung to the saddle horn, her small frame tense but steady. She didn't scream, didn't panic. Her strength was iron, though Eli could feel the tremor of exhaustion in her shoulders. She had endured too much to give Crane the satisfaction of weakness, and she wasn't about to give Eli pity either. The town shrank into the horizon. Mesquite bushes and dusty plains stretched wide, endless in the late afternoon sun. Eli guided, Dusty toward the distant hills, where his ranch sat like a stubborn patch of green among the golden gray. Neither of them spoke for miles. Eli wasn't a man of many words, and the girl didn't seem ready to offer hers. Silence, though heavy, was easier than fumbling through questions that had no gentle answers. When the ranch came into view, the girl finally broke the quiet. Her voice was raw but firm. "Why?" Eli glanced down at her, brow furrowed. "Why what?" "Why risk yourself?" she asked, eyes fixed on the land ahead. "You didn't know me?" Eli thought a moment before answering. "Didn't have to. Wrong's wrong, no matter who it's done to." She turned her head slightly, studying him, though she said nothing more. Eli could feel her scrutiny as sharp as a blade. They rode into the yard just as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The small ranch house stood plain but solid, its weathered wood worn by years of storms. Cattle lowed from the pasture, and a lone dog barked once before settling near the barn. Eli slid off Dusty, then reached to help her down. She resisted at first, pride stiff in her shoulders, but when her boots touched the ground, her knees buckled. Eli caught her arm, steadying her. "I'm fine," she said quickly, pulling away. "I know," Eli replied evenly, giving her space. He led Dusty to the water trough, letting the horse drink before turning back. "You're safe here. Crane's men won't ride out this far tonight." The girl scanned the land around them, the open fields, the wide horizon, the hills that framed the ranch like guardians. For the first time, her chest seemed to loosen, though wariness still lingered in her eyes. Inside, Eli lit a lantern and set a pot of water to boil. He offered her a seat at the rough-hewn table. She didn't sit immediately, circling the room like a caged hawk, testing her bars. Only after a long silence did she lower herself into a chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Eli slid a mug of water toward her. She lifted it carefully, sniffed it as though expecting poison, then drank in quick, small gulps. "What's your name?" Eli asked gently. She hesitated. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then softly she said, "Ahioka." Eli nodded once. "Ahioka, I'm Eli Turner." Her eyes flickered. "I know your kind, Eli Turner. Men who take what isn't theirs." "Men like him?" Eli shook his head. "I ain't Crane, and I didn't take you. You're free." The words hung between them. Free. They sounded fragile, like a bird's wing after a storm. Ahioka stared at her raw wrists, red and bruised, from the chains. She touched them absently, as if testing whether freedom was real. Her voice broke quieter this time. "He killed my brother, took me when I tried to stop him, said he'd sell me down south." The lantern light flickered across her face, highlighting the steel beneath her sorrow. She was young, but the fire in her eyes told Eli she'd already lived through more than most ever would. Eli's jaw tightened. "Then he's got debts more than money can cover?" Ahioka looked at him, searching for something in his expression. Maybe she was testing him, measuring whether he was just another man making promises he couldn't keep. Finally, she said, "If you hide me, he'll come, and he won't come alone." "I know," Eli replied. "You'll lose everything." Eli leaned back in his chair, gaze steady. "Some things are worth the loss." Ahioka studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. She didn't thank him, her pride wouldn't let her, but she didn't argue further. Instead, she sipped her water, her posture softening ever so slightly. Outside, the night deepened. Crickets sang in the grass, and the ranch seemed wrapped in uneasy peace. But both of them knew that beyond the hills, Crane was gathering his men, plotting vengeance. For tonight, though, Ahioka was free. And Eli Turner, once a man who kept to himself, had taken a stand that would change both their lives forever. The morning broke quiet, too quiet for Eli's liking. The ranch usually stirred with the bawl of cattle and the rustle of wind across the grass. But this morning the stillness was heavy, unnatural, like the pause before thunder splits the sky. Eli had been up before dawn, mending the fence line and checking the herd. His every step carried the weight of expectation. He knew Crane wouldn't let yesterday go. Men like Crane never forgot an insult, and Eli had done worse than insult him. He'd defied him in front of the whole town, shattered his power with a single act. Back at the house, Ayoka sat by the window, her dark hair falling across her shoulders. She wasn't idle. Her sharp eyes swept the horizon, searching for riders. She carried herself like someone used to vigilance, someone who knew danger didn't come with warning. "They'll come," she said quietly when Eli stepped inside. Eli removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "I know. You should have let me go. Alone I could have vanished into the hills." He wouldn't waste his wrath on one runaway. Eli shook his head. "That ain't how I'm made." Ayoka looked at him for a long moment, then turned her gaze back to the open land. Something unreadable flickered in her eyes, part frustration, part reluctant respect. By noon, the reckoning came. A column of dust rose on the eastern ridge. Eli spotted the glint of rifles and the dark silhouettes of riders. 8 men. At their head rode Crane, his fine clothes replaced with a long black coat, his face twisted with self-righteous fury. Eli's jaw set. "Stay inside. Keep low." Ayoka didn't move. "And let you face them alone?" "This is my fight." Her eyes burned. "No! It became mine the moment he put chains on me." Eli didn't argue. There was no time, and he saw the truth in her words. The riders fanned out as they approached, horses snorting, hooves pounding the dirt. Crane reined in at the gate, his voice cutting across the distance. "Turner!" he bellowed. "You've made yourself a thief and a traitor. Hand the girl over and maybe I'll leave you with your land." Eli stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, his voice calm. "You'll leave now, Crane. You and your men." Crane laughed, cold and bitter. "Or what? You'll shoot us all? You're one man against 8. "Sometimes one's enough," Eli said, leveling the rifle. The air cracked with tension, every man waiting for the first spark. Then Crane snapped his hand down, and his men surged forward. Gunfire split the silence. Bullets tore through the yard, shattering wood, sending chickens squawking in a flurry of feathers. Eli fired back, dropping one rider from his horse. Another bullet whizzed past his ear, slamming into the porch beam. Ayoka darted to the side window, seized Eli's spare revolver from the shelf, and returned fire. Her shot clipped a rider's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Eli spared her a glance, sharp, impressed, but said nothing. They were fighting side by side now, no more questions between them. Crane hung back, sneering, letting his men bleed for him. He shouted orders, promising gold, land, anything if they'd bring him Ayoka alive. His voice was a serpent's hiss. In the chaos, Eli ducked behind the water trough, reloading. "Keep low!" he shouted to Ayoka. "I've been hunted before!" she shouted back, her revolver barking another shot. The firefight raged, dust and smoke blurring the yard. Horses screamed, men cursed, the smell of blood and gunpowder thick in the air. Eli moved with steady precision, every pull of the trigger measured, every target chosen. Ayoka, though raw, was fearless, her shots wild at first, but growing sharper, with each squeeze. One by one, Crane's men fell or fled, their bravado crumbling against the stubborn defense of a lone cowboy and a girl who refused chains. At last, silence fell. 3 men lay wounded, 2 dead, the rest galloping into the distance. Crane was alone, his horse trembling beneath him. His face was pale now, sweat shining on his brow. Eli stepped into the open, rifle still in hand. "It's over, Crane." But Crane's fury was bottomless. He yanked a pistol from his coat and aimed, not at Eli, but at Ahyoka, standing near the window. Time slowed. Eli's heart hammered once, hard. Then his rifle cracked. Crane's pistol flew from his hand, his scream echoing as he toppled from the saddle, writhing in the dirt. Eli strode forward, boots crunching gravel, rifle steady on the fallen man. Crane glared up at him, hatred burning even through his pain. "You think you've won?" Crane rasped. "The town, the law, they'll come for you both." Eli's voice was quiet, resolute. "Let them come." Behind him, Ahyoka stepped out onto the porch, revolver still in her hand, eyes blazing. She stood beside Eli, unflinching. The reckoning had come, and though it wasn't finished, one truth was clear to everyone who would hear the story later. The quiet cowboy was no longer silent, and the girl who once wore chains was free by his side. The smoke of battle still clung to the ranch yard, mingling with the coppery tang of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder. Eli stood over Crane, chest rising and falling like the earth after a storm. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than the gunfire that had filled it minutes before. Crane writhed in the dust, clutching his shattered hand. His eyes burned with hatred, but his power was gone. His men lay scattered, dead, wounded, or fled, and the swaggering lord of the town was nothing more than a broken figure on the ground. Eli lowered his rifle slowly. Killing Crane outright would have been easy, but the thought sickened him. Death was too simple, too clean for a man like Crane. He deserved to live with the ruin of his pride. "Ride," Eli said flatly. "Ride far and don't you come back." Crane spat blood, his voice ragged. "You think this ends here, Turner? The law's on my side. The town's mine. You'll hang for this." Eli didn't answer. He simply stepped back, eyes hard. "Go!" Crane staggered to his feet, cursing, and climbed onto his trembling horse with his uninjured hand. With one last venomous glare, he wheeled the animal around and disappeared down the road, a shadow fleeing the light. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Eli let out a long, weary breath. He turned to find Ahyoka still standing on the porch, revolver dangling at her side. Her hair was windswept, her face streaked with sweat and dust, but her eyes were steady. "He'll come again," she said quietly. "Maybe," Eli replied. He slid the rifle back into its place, wiping the sweat from his brow. "But next time he won't find us unready." Ahyoka stepped down from the porch and walked toward him, her boots crunching on the dirt. For the first time, the hardness in her posture eased. She looked around at the ranch, the wounded earth, the bullet-scarred beams, the wide-open sky stretching above. Her lips parted as if she was tasting the idea of freedom for the first time. "This place," she said softly, "it feels alive." Eli gave a faint smile, rare but genuine. "It's yours as much as mine now." She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if testing his words for cracks. "You don't know me, Eli Turner. You don't know what I've lost, what I carry." "I don't need to know," Eli said gently. "I only know no one should ever chain you again." For the first time since he'd found her in town, a flicker of warmth touched her face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. They spent the rest of the day tending to the wounded men who still lived. Eli's sense of right and wrong wouldn't let him leave them to die, even if they had ridden with Crane. Ahyoka helped silently, her hands steadied despite the blood. Compassion was in her bones, though the world had tried to beat it out of her. By sundown, the ranch was quiet again. The dead were buried beyond the hills, the wounded sent limping back toward town. Crane's shadow still lingered, but for the first time in a long while, the land felt at peace. That night, Eli lit the lantern on the porch. He sat on the steps, listening to the crickets and the whisper of wind across the grass. Ahyoka joined him, wrapping her arms around her knees, her gaze fixed on the stars. "They say the sky is the same everywhere," she murmured. "But I wonder if freedom makes it look different." Eli tilted his head back, studying the endless expanse of starlight. "Maybe it does." Silence stretched between them, not the uneasy kind they'd shared before, but something softer, almost companionable. "You'll have to choose," Ahyoka said finally. "If you keep me here, you'll be hunted. By Crane, by the law, by anyone who thinks they can break us." Eli's jaw tightened. "Then let them try." She turned her head toward him, her eyes glinting in the lamplight. For a long moment, she searched his face. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. The quiet cowboy had chosen his path, and she had chosen to walk it with him. As dawn painted the horizon in shades of gold and rose, Eli and Ahyoka stood together on the porch. The land stretched before them, scarred yet unbroken, much like themselves. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them side by side. And though the town might whisper and Crane might plot, the story had already begun to spread. Of the quiet cowboy who defied a tyrant and the native girl who broke her chains. It was a story no one would forget.